Your DNA is hiding something, a scar, a record of a catastrophe so severe that it nearly ended the human species before civilization even began. Geneticists found it in the 1970s. They did not understand it until the 1990s, and the full story is still being debated today. 74,000 years ago, the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years turned the sky to ash, the world to winter, and the human population to a number so small it could fit inside a single building. But before we begin, if you enjoy these nighttime journeys, remember to like and subscribe. Now, let us begin. Tonight, we are going back further than any written record, further than any monument, further than the oldest city or the first scratches of language on stone. We are going back 74,000 years, to a day that almost ended everything. A day when a mountain on a tropical island tore itself apart, when the sky turned to ash, and when temperatures across the planet dropped so far that entire forests died standing. We are going to trace the evidence that says the human species, every single person alive today, may descend from a population so small it could fit inside a single modern high school gymnasium. We will follow the trail through volcanic glass, through ancient DNA, through the rings of ice cores pulled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, and we will ask the most unsettling question in all of human history. How close did we actually come to vanishing from the Earth forever? The answer is closer than you think. Chapter 1. The day the sky disappeared. Imagine a morning, not a special morning, just another sunrise over the islands of Southeast Asia, roughly 74,000 years ago. The air is warm. Tropical forest runs from shore to ridge in an unbroken sweep of green. Monkeys call from the canopy. Rivers push through limestone gorges toward the sea. Somewhere on the island we now call Sumatra, steam threads up from vents on a broad volcanic plateau. The mountain has been restless, but it has been restless before. The local wildlife pays no attention. There is no alarm. There is no warning system. There is only the slow pulse of geology, the buildup of magma miles beneath the surface, and the thinning crust above it holding back a force that has been gathering for hundreds of thousands of years. Then comes the rupture. It does not begin with a sound. It begins with the ground itself moving in a way that no creature alive has ever experienced. The surface lurches, trees tilt, boulders roll. The ground cracks open along fracture lines that run for miles, and then, in a single catastrophic release, the roof of the magma chamber fails. What follows is the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years of Earth history. The explosion is not like a bomb. It is like the planet opening a wound. A column of superheated gas, rock, and ash rockets into the atmosphere at speeds exceeding the speed of sound. Within minutes, the eruption plume reaches the stratosphere, punching through the lower layers of the atmosphere and climbing to altitudes above 25 miles. The column is so wide, so dense, and so violent that it generates its own weather. Lightning flickers inside the plume. Thunder rolls across hundreds of miles of ocean. The sky above Sumatra goes black. But the column is only the beginning. When the eruption reaches full force, the sheer volume of material being ejected is beyond anything the modern world has experienced. Estimates based on geological fieldwork suggest the Toba eruption expelled roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. For perspective, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, one of the most famous volcanic events in American memory, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba released nearly 3,000 times that amount. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which produced a sound heard thousands of miles away and generated tsunamis that killed tens of thousands of people, ejected roughly 25 cubic kilometers. Toba dwarfed even that by a factor of more than 100. At the summit of the eruption, the magma chamber itself collapses. The roof caves in. The ground above drops by hundreds of meters, creating an enormous depression in the earth called a caldera. That caldera, roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, would eventually fill with water and become the largest volcanic lake on the planet. Today, it is called Lake Toba. It sits on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, deceptively calm and stunningly beautiful. A tourist destination. Boats drift across its surface. Villages cluster along its shores. The jungle presses against its rim. But beneath that peaceful water lies the scar of a detonation so vast it reshaped the atmosphere of the entire planet. The immediate effects radiated outward in waves of destruction. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and fragmented rock moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour swept across the landscape surrounding the caldera. These flows buried an area of roughly 20,000 to 30,000 square kilometers, under deposits nearly 100 meters thick in places. Nothing survived in their path. Every tree, every animal, every insect within that radius was incinerated or entombed. The destruction was total and nearly instantaneous. Beyond the reach of the pyroclastic flows, ash fell from the sky. Not the light dusting of a moderate eruption, but thick blankets of volcanic debris. Across the Indian subcontinent, ash accumulated in layers several centimeters deep. In parts of India, deposits reached 15 centimeters. On the floor of the Indian Ocean and in sediment cores pulled from the South China Sea, the ash signature is unmistakable. The eruption left its fingerprint across more than 40 million square kilometers of the planet, roughly 7.5% of the entire surface of the Earth. But ash on the ground, devastating as it was, represented only a fraction of the danger. The true weapon of the Toba eruption was what it sent into the upper atmosphere. Sulfur. Enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide were injected into the stratosphere, where chemical reactions converted them into tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets, called aerosols, are extraordinarily effective at reflecting sunlight back into space before it can reach the surface. The result is planetary cooling. Every major volcanic eruption in recorded history has produced some degree of this effect. The eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, a moderate event by geological standards, lowered global average temperatures by about half a degree Celsius for a year or two. The Toba eruption injected perhaps 100 times more sulfur into the stratosphere than Pinatubo. The cooling effect was proportionally severe. Climate models suggest that in the years immediately following the Toba eruption, global average temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In the northern hemisphere, the drop may have been even steeper, perhaps as much as 10 degrees in the first year. Winter arrived early and stayed late. Summers were cool and short. Growing seasons collapsed. Rainfall patterns shifted as the global water cycle slowed. Forests in the middle and high latitudes lost their leaves and, in many cases, died. Grasslands dried out, rivers shrank, lakes fell. Snow accumulated in places that rarely saw it and stayed far longer than it should have. The Earth entered what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of severe climate disruption driven not by the slow orbital wobbles that cause ice ages, but by the sudden injection of reflective particles into the upper atmosphere. The volcanic winter caused by Toba lasted an estimated 6 to 10 years. Some modeling suggests the cooling effect persisted at detectable levels for decades. And critically, the eruption occurred at a moment when the planet was already sliding into a colder phase. Earth was transitioning from a warmer interglacial period into a glacial stage. The Toba eruption landed on top of this natural cooling trend and, according to some researchers, accelerated it sharply. Ice cores from Greenland show a distinct spike in sulfate deposits at the time of the eruption, followed by a period of intensified cooling that lasted roughly 1,000 years. Whether Toba caused that long cold period or merely coincided with it remains one of the most debated questions in paleoclimatology. But the short-term effects are beyond dispute. For a decade or more, The world was colder, darker, and drier than it had been in tens of thousands of years. Now, 74,000 years ago, the world was not empty of humans. Homo sapiens, our species, had been living in Africa for at least 100,000 years by this point, possibly longer. Small bands of modern humans had already ventured out of Africa and into the Near East, though those early migrations would largely fail. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, a mysterious relative known almost entirely from fragments of DNA and a handful of bones, lived in the highlands of Central and East Asia. Homo erectus, an older and more widespread species, may still have clung to survival in isolated pockets of Southeast Asia. The world of 74,000 years ago was a world of multiple human species, each adapted to its own environment, each following its own evolutionary path. And then the sky went dark. What happened next to all of those populations is one of the most important and most fiercely debated questions in the story of human evolution. The evidence is fragmentary. The witnesses are long dead. But the clues they left behind, in layers of volcanic ash, in the chemistry of ancient bones, in the sediment of lake beds, and most of all in the DNA of every person alive today, tell a story so dramatic that when scientists first pieced it together in the late 1990s, it sounded almost too extreme to be true. The story says that the human population, already small by the standards of most mammal species, crashed. Not to millions, not to hundreds of thousands, perhaps to as few as a few thousand breeding individuals scattered across the African continent. A population so tiny that a single disease, a single drought, a single unlucky season could have finished the job the volcano started. The story says that everything we are, every city, every language, every culture, every nation, every human being drawing breath at this moment traces back to that fragile remnant. A handful of survivors who held on through a decade of darkness, who found food when the forests failed, who kept their children alive when the world turned hostile, and who, against odds that would have doomed most species, slowly rebuilt. The question is whether this story is true, and if it is, what it means about who we are and how close we came to never existing at all. The evidence starts in the most unlikely of places. Not in the ground, not in the rocks, in our blood. That is where the next chapter takes us. Chapter 2, A World Before the Blast. To understand what the Toba eruption did to the human species, you first have to understand what the human species looked like before the eruption happened. And the answer is not what most people expect. We tend to imagine our ancestors as a vast population spread across the African continent, thriving, expanding, conquering new territory with each generation. The reality was almost the opposite. 74,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was a marginal species, successful in its niche, yes, intelligent, resourceful, capable of language and symbolic thought. But in terms of sheer numbers, humans were a minor player on the African landscape, and in terms of global reach, they were barely a footnote. Let us set the scene. Africa, 74,000 years ago, was not the Africa of today. The Sahara was even more formidable than it is now, a hyper-arid barrier dividing the continent into two ecological worlds. North of the desert, small bands of early humans and possibly other hominin species clung to the Mediterranean coast, surviving on what the sea and the narrow coastal strip could provide. South of the Sahara, the picture was more complex. East Africa, the region we now call Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, held scattered populations of Homo sapiens, living in environments that ranged from highland forest to open savanna to the shores of the Great Rift Valley lakes. Southern Africa had its own clusters, particularly along the coast, where shellfish, marine mammals, and tuber plants offered a dependable food supply. Central Africa, blanketed by dense tropical forest, was likely sparsely populated. Humans of this era were primarily open country and woodland species. The deep forest was hard to navigate, hard to hunt in, and hard to sustain a group through year after year. The total population of Homo sapiens on Earth at this time is difficult to estimate with precision, but genetic evidence and demographic modeling suggest it was remarkably small, perhaps a few 100,000 individuals, perhaps fewer. Some models place the number as low as tens of thousands of effective breeding adults, the people actually producing the next generation. This is not a large number. For comparison, the city of Asheville, North Carolina, a small American city, has a population of roughly 90,000. The entire human species, stretched across a continent the size of Africa, may have been smaller than that single town. Why so few? Several factors kept the population in check. First, the technology of the time, while impressive in its own context, imposed hard limits on group size and population density. These were Middle Stone Age people. Their toolkits included carefully shaped stone points, scrapers, and blades, many of them remarkably sophisticated. Some groups had begun to use compound adhesives, mixing plant resin with minerals to haft stone points onto wooden shafts. Others processed pigments like ochre, possibly for symbolic or protective purposes. There is evidence of beadwork, suggesting social signaling and perhaps early trade networks. The cognitive capacity was there, the material culture was advancing, but the basic mode of life was foraging. Small bands, typically numbering between 20 and 50 individuals, moved through the landscape, following the seasonal availability of plants, game, and water. Each band needed a large territory to sustain itself, which meant the land could only support a thin scattering of people. Second, Africa's climate was anything but stable during this period. The planet was oscillating between warmer and cooler phases, driven by long-term orbital cycles. Within those larger swings, shorter oscillations created pulses of aridity and humidity that could transform landscapes within a few centuries. A region that supported grasslands and game herds in one millennium might be semi-desert in the next. Lake levels rose and fell dramatically. Rivers shifted course. Forests expanded and contracted like a breathing lung. Human populations expanded during the good times and contracted sharply during the bad. This pattern of boom and bust left its mark on the genome. Long before Toba erupted, the human species had already experienced multiple episodes of population decline. The genetic record shows that Homo sapiens had low diversity compared to other great apes, particularly chimpanzees, long before the 74,000-year mark. Something, or more likely a series of somethings, had been squeezing the population for a very long time. Third, humans were not alone. Africa was home to an extraordinary diversity of large predators. Lions, leopards, hyenas, and African wild dogs competed with humans for prey and sometimes treated humans as prey. Crocodiles patrolled the rivers. Venomous snakes lay in the grass. Disease, carried by mosquitoes, ticks, and parasites adapted to African conditions over millions of years, was a constant threat. Malaria, in one form or another, has been shaping human genetics for hundreds of thousands of years. Infant mortality in these populations was staggering by modern standards. A woman might bear 6 or 8 children over her lifetime and see only 2 or 3 survive to adulthood. Life expectancy was short. Accidents, infections, predation, and starvation all took their toll. Maintaining a stable population under these conditions required every advantage that intelligence, cooperation, and cultural knowledge could provide. Beyond Africa, the picture was even more precarious. By 74,000 years ago, a few waves of Homo sapiens had left the continent and pushed into the Near East, and possibly as far as the Arabian Peninsula and the coast of South Asia. But these early migrations were fragile enterprises. Genetic evidence suggests that most of them failed. The populations that ventured out either died off or were absorbed back into the African gene pool. The successful migration, the one that would eventually populate the rest of the planet, had not yet happened. That would come later, perhaps around 60 to 70,000 years ago. At the time of the Toba eruption, the overwhelming majority of Homo sapiens still lived in Africa. They were not the only humans. Neanderthals, stocky and powerfully built, had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were skilled hunters, capable of taking down large game like mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, and bison. They made tools from stone and possibly from bone. They buried their dead, at least sometimes, and there is growing evidence they used pigments and created simple ornaments. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. They were adapted to cold climates in ways that Homo sapiens was not, with shorter limbs, barrel chests, and a physiology tuned for energy conservation in harsh winters. At the time of Toba, Neanderthal populations were scattered across a vast territory from the Iberian Peninsula to the mountains of Central Asia. But like Homo sapiens, their numbers were small, perhaps a few tens of thousands at any given time. They lived in small bands. They needed large territories. They were not thriving. They were surviving. In the eastern reaches of Asia, the Denisovans occupied a world we are only beginning to understand. Known primarily from a finger bone and a few teeth found in a cave in Siberia, and from traces of their DNA surviving in the genomes of modern people in Oceania and Southeast Asia, the Denisovans were a population related to but distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. They may have ranged from the high Tibetan plateau, where genetic evidence suggests they carried adaptations to extreme altitude, to the tropical lowlands of Southeast Asia and the islands beyond. Their tool use, their culture, their numbers, all remain largely mysterious. What we know is that they existed, that they were human in every meaningful sense, and that they too would face what Toba brought. And then there was Homo erectus, the survivor. This species had left Africa nearly 2 million years ago and colonized territory from the Mediterranean to Java. Erectus had fire, Erectus had tools, Erectus had persistence. But by 74,000 years ago, Erectus was a relic, hanging on in a few isolated corners of Southeast Asia, while younger, more flexible species dominated the landscape. Whether Erectus still survived at the time of Toba is debated. Some evidence from the island of Java suggests small populations may have persisted until as recently as 50,000 years ago. If so, they would have been among the most vulnerable to any catastrophe. This was the world that Toba shattered, a world of multiple human species, all of them living in small, scattered populations, all of them vulnerable to environmental disruption. None of them had agriculture. None of them had permanent settlements. None of them had surplus food stored against disaster. They lived season to season, generation to generation, their survival dependent on the continued functioning of ecosystems they did not control and could not fully predict. The margins were thin. A drought lasting several years could crash a regional population. A disease moving through a band of 30 people could wipe it out entirely. A shift in the migration pattern of a key prey species could force a group to abandon territory it had occupied for generations. Humans survived not because they were invulnerable, but because they were adaptable, because their brains allowed them to solve problems in real time, to cooperate across family lines, to transmit knowledge through language, and to innovate when the old ways stopped working. But adaptability has its limits. When the disruption is large enough, fast enough, and sustained enough, even the most resourceful species can be pushed beyond recovery. The question that Toba poses is whether the eruption pushed humanity to that edge, whether the volcanic winter, the failed harvests, the collapsing food webs, the decade of darkness and cold, reduced the human population to a number so small that extinction was not a distant theoretical risk, but an immediate, pressing reality. To answer that question, we need to understand exactly what the eruption did to the planet, how the climate responded, how ecosystems reacted, and what the archaeological record says about human activity before and after the blast. We have already seen the eruption itself. In the next chapter, we will follow the ash cloud as it spreads across the globe, and we will see what happens when one of the most powerful geological events in Earth history collides with a world already tilting toward cold. The mountain that swallowed itself is next. Chapter 3. The mountain that swallowed itself. The Toba caldera sits on the northern end of the island of Sumatra, straddling the equator in one of the most geologically violent regions on Earth. Sumatra is part of the Sunda Arc, a chain of volcanic islands formed by the collision of the Indo-Australian tectonic plate with the Eurasian plate. As the oceanic plate dives beneath the continental crust, it descends into the mantle, where intense heat and pressure melt rock into magma. That magma rises, it accumulates in vast underground chambers, and periodically, catastrophically, it finds a way to the surface. Toba is not a single volcano. It is a complex, a system of overlapping calderas that have erupted multiple times over the past 1.2 million years. The earliest known eruption occurred roughly 1.2 million years ago, followed by another roughly 840,000 years ago. The eruption 74,000 years ago, known to geologists as the youngest Toba Tuff, or YTT, was the most recent and by far the most powerful. It was not just the largest eruption in the last 2 million years. It may be one of the largest explosive eruptions in the entire geological record of the Cenozoic era, the last 66 million years of Earth history. To appreciate the scale, you have to think about what a supervolcano actually is. An ordinary volcano is a mountain with a conduit, a pipe through which magma travels from a chamber deep underground to the surface. When pressure builds and the conduit clears, the volcano erupts. The eruption might be gentle, with lava flowing down the slopes, or it might be explosive, with ash and gas blasting into the sky. Either way, the volcano keeps its basic shape. A supervolcano is fundamentally different. A supervolcano has a magma chamber so vast that when it erupts, the entire roof of the chamber collapses. The mountain does not erupt from a summit. The mountain disappears into itself. What remains is a caldera, a depression, a hole in the ground where a mountain used to be. The Toba caldera is roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. That is not a typo. The hole left by the eruption is approximately 62 miles in one direction and 19 miles in the other. The caldera walls rise steeply, 400 to 1,200 meters above the lake that now fills the depression. Lake Toba itself covers roughly 1,700 square kilometers, making it the largest volcanic lake on Earth and one of the deepest, with a maximum depth of over 500 meters. Samosir Island, a landmass the size of Singapore that sits inside the lake, is a resurgent dome, a mound of rock pushed upward by residual magma pressure after the eruption. The entire landscape is a monument to the scale of what happened. The eruption itself probably lasted between 9 and 14 days. That estimate comes from the analysis of graded bedding in deep-sea ash deposits, the way particles of different sizes settled through the water column after falling from the sky. Larger, heavier fragments settled first. Finer ash settled later. The layering pattern tells geologists roughly how long material was being ejected: 9 to 14 days. Less than 2 weeks for the planet to receive one of the most severe geological insults in the history of complex life. During those days, the eruption plume rose continuously into the stratosphere, carrying with it an estimated 3,800 cubic kilometers of material, measured in dense rock equivalent. That figure includes the ash that blanketed the surrounding region, the pyroclastic density currents that swept across Sumatra, and the fine particles lofted into the upper atmosphere and dispersed by stratospheric winds. The pyroclastic flows alone covered an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 square kilometers, burying the landscape under deposits that reached 600 meters thick inside the caldera and nearly 100 meters thick in the surrounding terrain. These flows moved at speeds that may have exceeded 100 kilometers per hour, carrying superheated gas at temperatures above several hundred degrees Celsius. Nothing in their path survived. The ash fall spread far beyond Sumatra. Carried by atmospheric circulation, volcanic debris drifted westward across the Indian Ocean and southward toward the southern hemisphere. In India, the ash layer is found at numerous archaeological and geological sites. In some locations, deposits reached 6 meters in thickness, 20 feet of volcanic debris blanketing the ground. Across the Indian subcontinent more broadly, a layer of 5 centimeters or more covered vast areas. In the Arabian Sea, the ash signature appears in deep-sea sediment cores. In the South China Sea, deposits of 3.5 centimeters have been measured. On the floor of the central Indian Ocean, 10 centimeters. The total area covered by at least 1 centimeter of ash exceeded 38 million square kilometers, roughly 7.5% of the Earth's surface. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from the other side of the planet. In recent years, scientists have identified microscopic glass shards called cryptotephra in sediment cores from sites in East Africa, more than 7,300 kilometers from the eruption. These shards are tiny, smaller than the diameter of a human hair. They are invisible to the naked eye and can only be detected through painstaking laboratory analysis. But when their chemical composition is tested, it matches the fingerprint of the Toba eruption precisely. The ash from Toba reached Africa. It drifted across the Indian Ocean, over the Horn of Africa, and settled into the sediments of Lake Malawi and archaeological sites in Ethiopia and South Africa. This discovery expanded the known dispersal range of Toba ash by nearly 3,000 kilometers and demonstrated that the eruption's physical effects reached the very continent where most of the human species lived. The ash on the ground was devastating enough. Thick deposits would have smothered vegetation, contaminated water sources, and killed or displaced animals. Grazing lands would have been buried. Edible plants would have been choked. Rivers and streams would have run thick with volcanic sediment for months, possibly years, as rainfall washed ash from hillsides into waterways. For humans living by foraging, the loss of plant foods and the disruption of animal populations would have been an immediate crisis, but the longer-term threat came from above. The eruption injected colossal quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Estimates vary, but the most widely cited figures suggest Toba released roughly 3.3 times 10 to the 15th power grams of sulfur, an almost incomprehensible amount. For comparison, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo released approximately 17 million tons of sulfur dioxide and caused a measurable cooling of the planet for 2 years. Toba released perhaps 100 times more. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor and other compounds to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These aerosol particles are remarkably stable at stratospheric altitudes, remaining suspended for years. They are also extraordinarily efficient at scattering incoming sunlight, reflecting it back into space before it can warm the surface. The result is a dimming of the sun as seen from the ground, a haze that turns the sky milky white, mutes the colors of sunrise and sunset, and reduces the total amount of solar energy reaching the planet's surface. Climate models built to simulate the aftermath of the Toba eruption paint a grim picture. In the first year after the eruption, global average temperatures may have dropped by 3.5 degrees Celsius. Some models suggest the drop was even larger, approaching 5 degrees in certain regions. In the northern hemisphere, the cooling was more extreme, with temperature reductions of perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius in the first year. This is not a subtle change. A drop of 3 to 5 degrees in global average temperature is roughly equivalent to the difference between the present climate and the peak of the last ice age, compressed into a single year rather than unfolding over thousands of years. The effects cascaded through every ecosystem on the planet. In the tropics, The cooling reduced evaporation from the oceans, weakening the monsoons that deliver moisture to South and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Rainfall declined, drought spread. Tropical forests, which depend on consistent warmth and moisture, came under severe stress. Some research suggests significant deforestation in South Asia in the wake of the eruption, as indicated by changes in pollen records from lake sediments. In the mid-latitudes, the growing season shortened dramatically. Plants that depend on specific temperature thresholds for germination, flowering, and fruiting would have failed. Crops, had any existed, would have withered. Grasslands that supported grazing animals would have dried out and browned. Animals that depended on those grasses would have starved or migrated. Predators that depended on those animals would have followed or perished. But there was another dimension to the damage that scientists have only recently begun to understand. In 2021, a study published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment used Earth system model simulations to show that the sulfur emissions from Toba did not just cool the planet. They also destroyed the ozone layer. The massive injection of sulfuric acid aerosols into the stratosphere blocked the ultraviolet light needed to drive the photochemical reactions that create ozone. In the tropics, where sunlight is most intense and ozone production is normally highest, the depletion was catastrophic. Ozone levels dropped to exceptionally low values and remained depleted for over a year. With the ozone layer compromised, ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface would have spiked, damaging plants, harming animals, increasing the risk of eye damage and skin burns, and disrupting the base of aquatic food chains by killing phytoplankton near the surface of lakes and oceans. The combination of cooling, drought, darkness, and ultraviolet stress created conditions unlike anything the living world had experienced in tens of thousands of years. And critically, these conditions persisted. The aerosol veil did not clear in weeks, it lasted for years. Some estimates suggest that detectable cooling persisted for a decade or more after the eruption. Ice core records from Greenland show a sulfate spike at approximately 74,000 years ago, followed by accelerated cooling that some researchers link to a weakening of the Atlantic Ocean circulation patterns. The cold did not just visit, it moved in, and it stayed. For a species already living on thin margins, scattered across a continent in small bands dependent on functioning ecosystems for every meal, the Toba eruption was not just a disaster. It was a test of survival at the most fundamental level, a test that most species, given similar circumstances, would have failed. Whether humans passed that test and how many survived to tell the tale is the story of the next chapter. The question is not whether the eruption was devastating. It was. The question is what it left behind. When the ash settled, when the sky slowly cleared, when the cold finally began to lift, how many of us were still standing? The answer, written in our very DNA, is astonishing. Chapter 4. When the sun went dark, the ash fell for weeks, in some places for months. Long after the eruption column collapsed and the pyroclastic flows settled into stillness on Sumatra, the finest particles of volcanic debris continued to drift through the stratosphere, carried by high-altitude winds across hemispheres. In India, the landscape changed overnight. Fields that had been green were now grey. Rivers that had been clear ran thick with sediment the color of wet cement. Trees, their leaves buried under centimeters of fine ash, struggled to photosynthesize. Some survived, many did not. The smell of sulfur lingered in the air, not the sharp tang of a struck match, but a heavy, persistent sourness that settled into everything. For the animals, the crisis was immediate. Grazing species depend on grass. When grass is buried under 5 or 10 or 15 centimeters of volcanic ash, it might as well not exist. Herbivores that could not find alternative food sources began to weaken within days. Those that migrated survived longer, but migration requires energy, And energy requires food, and food was scarce in every direction. Predators felt the squeeze almost as quickly. When prey populations crash, predator populations follow. The die-off rippled through food webs across thousands of kilometers of South and Southeast Asian landscape. In the oceans, the effects were different, but no less severe. Volcanic ash settling on the surface of tropical seas added iron and other nutrients that triggered brief, intense blooms of phytoplankton. These blooms consumed oxygen as they decayed, creating dead zones in the shallow waters. Coral reefs, sensitive to changes in water temperature, light levels and chemistry, suffered from the reduced sunlight filtering through the aerosol-laden atmosphere. The combination of cooling surface waters and dimmed light suppressed photosynthesis throughout the marine food chain, but it was the atmosphere itself that carried the longest-lasting damage. The sulfuric acid aerosol veil spread across both hemispheres within weeks of the eruption. Stratospheric winds distributed the particles from the tropics toward the poles, creating a thin but persistent haze that reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. The effect is sometimes described as a dimming, and that word is appropriate. Imagine a permanent overcast, but subtler, a thinning of the light that makes midday feel like late afternoon, that steals the warmth from sunlight even when the sky appears mostly clear. Trees that had survived the initial ash fall now faced a longer, more insidious challenge. Reduced light means reduced photosynthesis. Reduced photosynthesis means reduced growth, reduced fruiting, reduced food production at every level of the ecosystem. For humans living in Africa, thousands of kilometers from the eruption, the ash fall itself was minimal. Cryptotephra has been found at sites in Ethiopia and South Africa, proving that fine particles reach the continent, but not in quantities sufficient to bury landscapes or poison water supplies directly. The immediate physical destruction, the pyroclastic flows, the heavy ash deposits, those were Sumatra's burden. Africa's burden was different. Africa got the cold. The volcanic winter descended on the African continent like a slow-moving wave. Temperatures dropped, not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily and persistently over months and then years. East Africa, already subject to strong seasonal variation, experienced longer and more severe dry seasons. The monsoon rains that sustain the grasslands and woodlands of the Rift Valley weakened as tropical evaporation declined. Rivers that flowed year-round became seasonal. Rivers that were seasonal dried up entirely. Lakes shrank. Waterholes that had been reliable gathering points for animals and humans alike became scarce and contested. The savannas, the great open grasslands that were the primary habitat of African Homo sapiens, were particularly vulnerable. Grass is remarkably resilient in the face of drought and fire, but it depends on a minimum threshold of rainfall. When that threshold is not met, grass retreats, leaving bare soil exposed to erosion by wind and what little rain does fall. The animals that depend on grass, zebra, antelope, wildebeest, follow the grass or die. The humans that depend on those animals follow the herds or find alternatives. Some bands would have shifted to coastal resources, shellfish and marine plants. Others would have turned to tubers and underground storage organs, plants that bank their energy below the surface, where drought cannot easily reach it. Still others would have clustered around the remaining water sources, competing for diminished resources in an increasingly crowded and desperate landscape. Recent archaeological evidence from the Horn of Africa offers a remarkably detailed window into how this played out. At a site called Shinfa Metema 1, located in the lowlands of northwest Ethiopia, near the Shinfa River, a tributary of the Blue Nile, researchers have uncovered evidence of continuous human occupation spanning the period before, during, and after the Toba eruption. The key to the discovery was Cryptotephra, those microscopic glass shards from the eruption, found embedded in the archaeological sediments. The chemistry of the shards matches the Toba fingerprint precisely, linking the site's stratigraphy directly to the eruption with a resolution of weeks. What the researchers found was striking. Before the eruption, the inhabitants of Sumatra 1 lived primarily by hunting terrestrial animals. Bones recovered from the site include antelope, pigs, monkeys, and other land mammals. Cut marks on the bones indicate butchery. Evidence of controlled fire suggests cooking. The site was occupied during a period of already significant aridity, with long, dry seasons comparable to some of the most seasonally dry habitats in modern East Africa. Then the eruption happened. The cryptotephra marks the moment, and after that moment, something changed. The dry seasons became longer and more severe. The Shinfa River, which normally flowed year-round or nearly so, began to stop flowing during the driest months, leaving behind a series of isolated waterholes scattered along the riverbed. Animals that depended on the river for drinking water congregated around these waterholes. As the pools shrank, fish that had been living in the flowing river became trapped. Easy to catch, easy to harvest. The archaeological record at Sumatra 1 shows a dramatic shift in diet. Fish remains increased sharply in the post-eruption layers. Humans adapted. They switched from hunting land animals as their primary food source to harvesting fish from the shrinking waterholes. It was not a choice born of luxury. It was survival pragmatism of the highest order. But perhaps the most remarkable finding was the stone tools. Among the artifacts recovered from the Toba-era layers at Sumatra 1 were small, symmetrical, triangular points, unlike anything typically found in Middle Stone Age tool assemblages. Analysis of their shape, size, weight, and the patterns of damage on their edges strongly suggests that these points were arrowheads. If that interpretation is correct, and the evidence is compelling, these artifacts represent the oldest known evidence of archery anywhere in the world, 74,000 years old, predating by tens of thousands of years the next oldest contenders. The implications are profound. Archery is not a simple technology. It requires understanding of leverage, tension, trajectory, and materials science. You need a bow, which requires flexible wood or other elastic material shaped and strung under tension. You need arrows, which require shafts of appropriate weight and stiffness, points of the right size and shape, and probably fletching of feathers or other material for stability in flight. Each component must work with the others. The system demands planning, experimentation, and cultural transmission. One person invents or refines an element. Others learn it, practice it, and pass it on. Archery is a technological system, not a single invention. And it appeared, or at least it left its first clear evidence, at precisely the moment when humans were under maximum environmental stress from the Toba eruption. This is not coincidence. This is adaptation under pressure. Similar patterns have been found at sites in South Africa. At Pinnacle Point, an archaeological site on the coast overlooking the Indian Ocean, researchers found evidence of continuous human occupation through the Toba period. Cryptotephra matching the Toba chemical signature was identified in the sediment layers, bracketing the eruption in the archaeological record. Below the ash, human artifacts. Within the ash, human artifacts. Above the ash, human artifacts. People were there before the eruption, they were there during it, and they were there after it. More importantly, the post-eruption layers showed evidence of technological innovation. Stone tools became more refined. Heat treatment of stone, a technique where raw material is deliberately heated in controlled fires to improve its flaking properties, became more common. These were not people in collapse. These were people innovating their way through a crisis. The evidence from Pinnacle Point led its excavators to argue that the South African coast may have served as a refuge for Homo sapiens during the volcanic winter. The coast offers advantages that inland environments do not. Marine food sources, shellfish, fish, seals, seabirds, are less affected by volcanic cooling than terrestrial ecosystems. The ocean moderates temperature swings, keeping coastal areas warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the interior. Even during a volcanic winter, the coast would have been more habitable than the drought-stricken interior. but the coast is a narrow strip. It can support only so many people. If the interior populations crashed and survivors streamed toward the coast, the carrying capacity would have been stretched thin. Competition would have intensified. Bands that had previously occupied distinct territories would have been forced into closer contact, creating opportunities for both conflict and cooperation, for the sharing of ideas and technologies, and for the kinds of social pressures that drive cultural evolution forward. India offers a more ambiguous picture. At the Jureru Valley in southern India, stone tools have been found both above and below a thick layer of Toba ash. The tools are similar on both sides of the ash layer, suggesting that whoever made them survived the eruption and continued their way of life without dramatic change. This has been cited as evidence against the Toba catastrophe theory, suggesting that at least some populations in South Asia weathered the eruption successfully. But critics point out that the tools below and above the ash may not represent the same population. There is a possible gap in the sediment record. The original inhabitants may have been wiped out, and the site may have been reoccupied later by newcomers arriving from elsewhere. At another site in India, the Middle Sun Valley, the picture is darker. There, evidence suggests a significant decline in human activity after the eruption, consistent with a major population loss. The archaeological record, in other words, is patchy. It tells us that some humans survived. It tells us that those survivors adapted, sometimes brilliantly, but it cannot tell us how many survived. It cannot tell us how many bands, how many families, how many individuals made it through the darkest years. For that, we need a different kind of evidence. We need to look not at what humans made, but at what humans are. We need to look at the genome. In the next chapter, we follow the trail of survival not through stone and bone, but through blood and DNA. The survivors left their signature in every cell of every person alive today. And what that signature reveals is breathtaking. Chapter 5. The Survivors. Here is a fact that should unsettle you. Humans are genetically boring. Not boring in the sense that our genome is uninteresting. It is spectacularly complex. Boring in the sense that for a species of nearly 8 billion individuals spread across every continent and every climate zone on Earth, we are shockingly similar to one another. Take two random human beings from opposite ends of the planet, a farmer in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and a stockbroker in London, a fisherman in Senegal and a teacher in Tokyo. Compare their DNA sequence by sequence. The differences are tiny, vanishingly small. Humans carry less genetic diversity than most other large mammals, and far less than our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. This is strange. Genetic diversity in a species is a function of population size and time. Large populations accumulate more variation because more individuals means more chances for mutations to arise and spread. Old species accumulate more variation because they have had more time for those mutations to occur. Humans check both boxes. We are numerous and we are old. Homo sapiens has existed for at least 300,000 years. In that time, we should have built up far more genetic diversity than we actually have. Instead, the diversity in the entire human species is lower than the diversity found in a single population of Central African chimpanzees living in one patch of forest. Something happened. Something squeezed the genetic variation out of the human species. Something reduced our population to such a small number for such a significant period of time that most of the genetic lineages that existed before that event simply disappeared. They were not suppressed. They were lost. Permanently. Every generation, a tiny fraction of genetic variation is randomly discarded through a process called genetic drift. In large populations, drift is slow and its effects are negligible. In small populations, drift is fast and its effects are devastating. Rare genetic variants, the ones carried by only a few individuals, are the first to go. Then less rare variants follow. Within a few generations, a small population can lose a substantial fraction of its genetic heritage, even without any selective pressure at all. Just bad luck, just the mathematics of small numbers. This is what geneticists call a population bottleneck, and the human genome carries the unmistakable signature of one. The first hints came in the early 1970s, long before anyone connected the dots to Toba. In 1972, researchers analyzing human hemoglobins, the oxygen-carrying proteins in red blood cells, noticed something peculiar. Humans had very few variants. In most species, hemoglobin comes in a rich diversity of forms, each slightly different, each reflecting a long evolutionary history. In humans, the variation was strikingly limited. The researchers noted that to account for this low level of variation, the human population must have been very small for a surprisingly long time. The paper did not attract much attention at the time. Hemoglobin was just one protein, but the pattern would repeat. In the 1980s and 90s, the revolution in molecular biology opened the genome to direct study. Researchers began sequencing mitochondrial DNA, the small circular genome carried inside the energy-producing organelles of every cell. Mitochondrial DNA has a unique property. It is inherited exclusively from the mother. When a woman has children, she passes her mitochondrial DNA to all of them, sons and daughters alike. But only her daughters will pass it on to the next generation. Sons are dead ends for mitochondrial inheritance. This means that mitochondrial DNA traces a purely maternal line of descent from mother to daughter to granddaughter, stretching back into deep time. In 1987, a landmark study by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson at the University of California, Berkeley, compared mitochondrial DNA from 147 people drawn from 5 geographic populations. They constructed a family tree of mitochondrial lineages and traced them all back to a single common ancestor, a woman who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. The media seized on the result and called her Mitochondrial Eve. The name was catchy. It was also misleading. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive at her time. She was not the first woman. She was not the mother of all humans in the way that the biblical Eve is imagined. She was simply the woman whose mitochondrial DNA lineage happened to survive to the present day, while all other contemporary mitochondrial lineages eventually died out through the random process of genetic drift. She lived within a population. She had contemporaries. Many of those contemporaries have living descendants today, but none of those descendants carry the mitochondrial DNA of those other women. Somewhere in every line of descent from every other woman of that era, there is at least one generation where only sons were born and the mitochondrial line was broken. What Mitochondrial Eve tells us is not that humanity descends from a single woman. It tells us something more subtle and in some ways more alarming. It tells us that the effective population size of the human species, the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation, was small enough for a very long time that all mitochondrial lineages, except one, eventually vanished. Computer models suggest that for this to happen, on the timescale indicated by the genetic data, the effective population size of early Homo sapiens must have been on the order of 10,000 individuals or fewer for extended periods. 10,000. Not 10 million, not 1 million, 10,000. That number kept appearing. Study after study through the 1990s found the same thing. Different genes, different methodologies, different research groups, all converged on an effective population size in the range of roughly 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals during a critical window, somewhere between about 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Some estimates were even lower. A few placed the effective population size as low as 1,000. To be clear about what effective population size means, it is not the total number of humans alive at any given moment. It is a statistical concept, the number of individuals in an idealized population that would produce the same rate of genetic drift as the actual population. The real population might have been somewhat larger, perhaps 2 to 5 times larger than the effective size, because not everyone breeds. Sex ratios may be uneven, and some individuals contribute disproportionately to the next generation. But even if the total census population was 3 or 5 times the effective size, we are still talking about a species numbering in the tens of thousands, a species that could have been wiped out by a single prolonged drought, a species balanced on a knife edge. This is the genetic bottleneck, and in 1998, a physical anthropologist at the University of Illinois named Stanley Ambrose connected the genetic evidence to the geological evidence. He proposed what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. His argument was direct. The genetic data shows a bottleneck in the human population at roughly 70,000 years ago. The geological data shows the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years at approximately 74,000 years ago. The eruption caused a severe and prolonged volcanic winter. The volcanic winter would have devastated the ecosystems on which human populations depended. Put the pieces together, and the conclusion seemed inescapable. Toba caused the bottleneck. The eruption pushed humanity to the edge of extinction. Ambrose's paper was a bombshell. It connected 2 previously separate lines of evidence, the genetic and the geological, into a single dramatic narrative. It explained why humans have so little genetic diversity. It explained why all non-African populations are genetically even less diverse than African populations, because the migration out of Africa represented a second, nested bottleneck on top of the first. It explained the peculiar pattern of rapid population growth that genetic models detect at roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, the recovery phase after the crisis. And it provided a mechanism, a cause, a villain, Toba. The theory was elegant, compelling, and widely publicized. For a decade, it became the dominant explanation for the human genetic bottleneck. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, popular science books, and countless articles. The idea that a single volcanic eruption nearly wiped out the human species was irresistible. It combined deep time, catastrophe, survival against the odds, and the fragility of our existence into a narrative that resonated far beyond the scientific community. But science does not run on narratives. It runs on evidence. And as more evidence accumulated through the 2000s and 2010s, the picture became considerably more complicated. The Toba catastrophe theory, in its original and strongest form, began to face serious challenges. Not all scientists were convinced that the volcanic winter was as severe as initially modeled. Not all archaeological sites showed evidence of population collapse, and the genetic data itself turned out to be more nuanced than the initial analyses suggested. The debate that followed is one of the most fascinating in modern science. It touches on the limits of what we can know about the deep past, the dangers of drawing simple conclusions from complex data, and the remarkable resilience of a species that refuses to stay down. The next chapter takes us into that debate, into the evidence for and against the theory that Toba nearly ended the human story before it truly began. And it introduces a discovery even more startling, a bottleneck far older and far more severe, one that makes the Toba event look almost mild by comparison. Chapter 6. Written in Our Blood. The Toba catastrophe theory arrived in the scientific world like a thunderclap. It was dramatic, it was tidy. It connected a known geological event to a known genetic pattern and produced a story that made intuitive sense. A supervolcano erupts. The climate collapses. Humans nearly go extinct. The survivors rebuild. Everything we are flows from that narrow escape. For nearly a decade after Stanley Ambrose published his 1998 paper, the theory held the center of the conversation. It became the default explanation for the human genetic bottleneck, cited in hundreds of papers, taught in universities, featured in documentaries and museum exhibits around the world. Then the cracks began to appear. The first serious challenge came from climate science. The original models of the Toba volcanic winter were based on scaling up from smaller eruptions, particularly the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo. The logic was straightforward. Pinatubo injected about 17 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere and caused roughly half a degree of global cooling for a year or two. Toba injected perhaps 100 times more sulfur. Therefore, the cooling should have been roughly proportional, perhaps 50 times worse, enough to trigger a decade of winter and shatter ecosystems worldwide. But atmospheric chemistry does not scale linearly. In 2010, climate scientist Claudia Timrek at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg published a study that challenged the proportional scaling assumption. Her team used a sophisticated climate model that accounted for the microphysics of aerosol particles in the stratosphere. What they found was that when enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide are injected into the atmosphere, the resulting aerosol particles do not simply multiply in number, they also grow larger. Larger particles are heavier. Heavier particles fall out of the stratosphere faster, and while they are aloft, larger particles are less efficient at scattering sunlight per unit of mass than smaller ones. The implication was significant. The cooling caused by Toba was probably not 100 times worse than Pinatubo. It was worse, certainly, but the self-limiting physics of aerosol growth meant the volcanic winter was less extreme than the earliest models had predicted. Timrek's simulations suggested that global average temperatures dropped by perhaps 2 to 3 degrees Celsius in the years after the eruption, with regional variations. Within about 3 years, the cooling effects had diminished to levels within the normal range of climate variability. Still a severe shock, still capable of disrupting ecosystems, but perhaps not the decade-long nuclear winter scenario that the catastrophe theory required. Other climate studies reinforced the point. A 2013 study of sediment cores from Lake Malawi in East Africa, located more than 7,000 kilometers from Toba, found cryptotephra matching the eruption, but no evidence of significant climate disruption at the time. The pollen record in the core showed no major shift in vegetation. The lake level did not drop dramatically. The local ecosystem, while certainly not immune to global changes, did not experience the kind of catastrophic collapse that the strongest version of the theory predicted. The archaeological evidence told a similar story. In southern India, at the Jureru Valley, stone tools found above and below a thick layer of Toba ash were remarkably similar. The same techniques, the same styles, the same materials. If the eruption had wiped out the local population, as the catastrophe theory implied, one would expect to see either an absence of tools above the ash or a dramatically different toolkit reflecting a new population arriving from elsewhere. Instead, there was continuity. Whoever was making tools before the eruption was apparently still making them afterward. In South Africa, the evidence was even more striking. At Pinnacle Point and the nearby site of Vliesbaai, researchers found not just continuity through the Toba period, but evidence of innovation. Stone tool technology became more refined after the eruption, not less. Heat treatment of stone became more common. The toolkit diversified. The people at these sites were not collapsing. They were adapting, developing new techniques, and thriving in what should have been apocalyptic conditions. At Shinfa Metema 1 in Ethiopia, as we discussed in the previous chapter, the story was similar. Continuous occupation, dietary adaptation, possible invention of archery. If Toba had caused a near extinction, the archaeological sites closest to the event in time should show abandonment, sterile layers empty of human artifacts, followed by delayed and tentative reoccupation. Instead, they show persistence, creativity, problem-solving under pressure, the hallmarks not of a species dying, but of a species fighting to survive and succeeding. The genetic evidence itself became more complex as analytical methods improved. Early studies had estimated the bottleneck timing to somewhere between 50 and 100,000 years ago, a window broad enough to encompass the Toba eruption at 74,000 years. But as more genomes were sequenced and more sophisticated mathematical models were applied, the timing of the bottleneck began to shift and fragment. Some studies placed the most severe reduction in non-African populations at around 50 to 60,000 years ago, aligning not with Toba, but with the out-of-Africa migration, a separate event entirely. When a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa and colonized the rest of the planet, they carried only a fraction of Africa's genetic diversity with them. That alone could explain much of the reduced diversity seen in non-African populations today. African populations, meanwhile, showed a more gradual decline in effective population size over a longer period, starting well before Toba and continuing well after it. The bottleneck in Africa did not look like a single sharp crash followed by recovery. It looked like a slow squeeze, a prolonged period of low population size driven perhaps by climate oscillations, habitat fragmentation, and the normal challenges of life in a fluctuating environment. Toba may have made things worse, but it was not necessarily the cause. A 2020 study of DNA from 28 mammal species across every continent tested whether Toba left a detectable genetic signature in the animal kingdom. If the eruption caused a global ecological catastrophe, one would expect to see population bottlenecks not just in humans, but in many other species as well. The study found that only 3 of the 28 species showed evidence of rapid population changes coinciding with Toba. The majority showed no signal at all. This was difficult to reconcile with a theory that required a global environmental disaster severe enough to push humans to the edge of extinction. If the planet's ecosystems had truly collapsed, more species should have been affected. By the late 2010s, the scientific consensus had shifted. The Toba catastrophe theory, in its original and strongest form, was no longer the dominant explanation for the human genetic bottleneck. Most researchers acknowledged that the eruption was a significant event, possibly the largest volcanic eruption in human history, and that it caused real climate disruption. But the evidence no longer supported the claim that Toba alone was responsible for a near extinction of the human species. The bottleneck was real. The eruption was real. But the connection between them was weaker than Ambrose had originally proposed. This did not mean the bottleneck disappeared. The genetic evidence for a period of extremely low human population size remained robust. Humans still have less genetic diversity than chimpanzees. The effective population size during the late Pleistocene was still remarkably small. Something had kept the human species at low numbers for a very long time. If it was not Toba alone, then what was it? The answer, or at least part of it, may lie in something more prosaic, but also more relentless than a single volcanic eruption: climate. The late Pleistocene was a time of dramatic and repeated climate swings. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Interglacial periods brought warmth and then ceded to cold again. Within these larger cycles, shorter oscillations created pulses of drought and flood, expansion and contraction that rippled through ecosystems worldwide. Africa, the homeland of Homo sapiens, was particularly affected. The Sahara expanded and contracted like a living thing, opening and closing corridors of habitable land. East African lakes rose and fell by tens of meters, transforming the landscape from lush wetland to arid scrub and back again within centuries. Human populations expanded during the good times and contracted during the bad. Each contraction was a small bottleneck, a winnowing of genetic diversity. Over tens of thousands of years, these repeated contractions accumulated, steadily eroding the genetic variation of the species. Toba may have been one particularly severe contraction among many, or it may have coincided with a climate downturn that was already in progress, adding volcanic cooling on top of orbital cooling and tipping populations that were already stressed into crisis. The truth as is so often the case in science, is probably more complicated than any single story can capture. The human bottleneck was not caused by one event. It was caused by a long series of events, a history of living on the edge, of populations rising and falling, of lineages beginning and ending, of small bands scattered across a vast and unpredictable landscape, each one a candle in the wind. Toba may have been the strongest gust, but the wind had been blowing for a very long time. And there is one more twist, one more discovery that complicates the story even further and makes the Toba bottleneck look almost minor by comparison. A bottleneck so old and so severe that, when it was first announced, some scientists refused to believe it. That discovery, and the fierce debate it ignited, is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 7. The Mother of All Living. Before we go deeper into the ancient bottlenecks, we need to understand something about the tool that revealed them. The tool is DNA, and the way scientists read history from DNA is one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the last 50 years. Every cell in your body carries a genome, a complete set of instructions written in the chemical language of deoxyribonucleic acid. That genome contains roughly 3 billion base pairs, the individual chemical letters that spell out the code. Most of those letters are identical from one person to the next. The differences, the places where your sequence diverges from mine, are relatively few, but those differences are not random noise. They are history. Every difference between two genomes represents a mutation that occurred in someone at some point in the past and was passed down through the generations to the present day. By counting the differences and estimating how fast mutations accumulate, scientists can work backward through time, constructing a molecular clock that ticks in generations rather than seconds. Mitochondrial DNA, as we discussed, traces the maternal line. The Y chromosome traces the paternal line. Nuclear DNA, the vast bulk of the genome, traces a more complex web of ancestry, shuffled by recombination at every generation, blending contributions from mother and father into new combinations. Each of these genetic systems tells a slightly different story, because each is inherited in a different way and is subject to different evolutionary forces. But when you combine them, when you read the nuclear genome alongside the mitochondrial and Y chromosome data, a picture emerges. A picture of population size through time. The key concept is genetic diversity. In a large population, genetic diversity is high. Mutations arise, spread through subgroups, and persist for many generations. In a small population, diversity is low. Mutations still arise at the same rate, but random genetic drift eliminates most of them before they can spread. The smaller the population, the faster diversity is lost. By measuring the diversity present in modern human genomes and running mathematical models backward through time, geneticists can estimate how large the population was at various points in the past. This is how the Toba bottleneck was first detected. The remarkably low diversity of human mitochondrial DNA compared to that of chimpanzees and other great apes suggested that the human population had been very small at some point in the recent evolutionary past. The timing pointed to somewhere in the late Pleistocene, between 50 and 100,000 years ago. The effective population size pointed to roughly 3 to 10,000 breeding individuals. These numbers became the foundation of the Toba catastrophe theory. But the tools kept getting better. Genome sequencing became cheaper, faster, and more accurate. Larger datasets became available. New mathematical methods were developed to extract finer resolution demographic histories from genetic data. And as the resolution improved, the picture became both richer and more surprising. One of the most important developments was the concept of the coalescent. When geneticists compare gene sequences from different individuals, they can trace those sequences backward to their most recent common ancestor, the point where two lineages merge into one. This is the coalescence point. For mitochondrial DNA, all human lineages coalesce in mitochondrial Eve, roughly 200,000 years ago. For Y chromosome DNA, all male lineages coalesce in a figure sometimes called Y chromosome Adam, who lived perhaps 100 to 200,000 years ago. These two figures did not live at the same time. They were not a couple. They were not the only humans alive. They were simply the individuals whose particular genetic lineage happened, by the luck of the draw, to survive to the present in an unbroken chain, while all contemporary lineages were eventually broken. Different genes in the nuclear genome coalesce at different times, some very recently, some in the deep past. By analyzing the distribution of coalescence times across many genes, researchers can reconstruct the demographic history of the species with remarkable detail. Where coalescence times cluster, it suggests a small population size at that time, because in small populations, lineages merge faster. Where coalescence times spread out, it suggests a larger population, because in large populations, lineages take longer to find common ancestors. Through the 2000s and 2010s, this approach revealed that the demographic history of Homo sapiens was not a simple story of one bottleneck followed by expansion. It was a complex history of multiple contractions and expansions, of populations splitting and merging, of migrations and returns, of isolation and reconnection. The picture that emerged was less like a single bottleneck and more like a series of narrows in a river, places where the channels squeezed tight before widening again, each narrows leaving its mark on the genetic landscape. One particularly important insight came from comparing African and non-African populations. Non-African populations consistently show less genetic diversity than African ones. This pattern had long been attributed to the out-of-Africa migration, a founder event in which a small group left Africa and carried only a fraction of the continent's genetic diversity with them. But closer analysis revealed that even within Africa, diversity varied. West African populations, like the Yoruba, showed patterns suggesting a bottleneck at a different time than East African populations, like the Maasai or the Luhya. Southern African populations, like the San and the Ko, carried the deepest divergences, the oldest lineages, consistent with their being among the most ancient, continuously existing populations on the planet. The San people of southern Africa are sometimes described as the oldest population of modern humans. This does not mean they are primitive or unchanged. It means that the San lineage diverged from other human lineages earlier than most, perhaps 200,000 years ago or more, and has maintained a continuous presence in southern Africa ever since. Their genomes carry more genetic diversity than almost any other population on Earth. They are, in a sense, the closest living window into the deep past of our species. The mitochondrial lineages found in the San are the most diverse and the most basal on the human mitochondrial family tree. The branches that lead to all other human populations sprout from a trunk rooted in African populations like the San. This does not mean that mitochondrial Eve was San. It means that the San population retains the deepest memory of the ancestral population from which all modern humans descend. This has profound implications for understanding the bottleneck. If the human population was reduced to a few thousand individuals, and if that remnant population was concentrated in Africa, then the genetic signature of the bottleneck should be strongest in populations farthest from Africa, because they passed through an additional founder event during the out-of-Africa migration. And indeed, this is what the data shows. Non-African populations are less diverse than African ones. Populations at the greatest geographic distance from Africa, like indigenous Australians and Native Americans, are the least diverse of all. Each step away from Africa represents another squeeze through a narrow genetic channel. But here is where the story becomes truly strange. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam tell us about the maternal and paternal lineages respectively. They do not tell us about the total population. The nuclear genome does, And when researchers applied the most advanced demographic inference methods to large datasets of nuclear DNA, they found something unexpected. In 2023, a team of researchers led by Wangjie Hu and Haipeng Li at the Shanghai Institute of Nutrition and Health published a study in the journal Science that sent shockwaves through the field. Using a new computational method called FITCOL, which stands for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process, they analyzed genomic sequences from 3,154 individuals drawn from populations around the world. The method was designed to detect ancient changes in population size with greater sensitivity than previous approaches. What they found was a bottleneck, but not the Toba bottleneck, something far older and far more severe. According to their analysis, human ancestors went through a catastrophic population crash between approximately 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. The effective population size during this period was estimated at roughly 1,280 breeding individuals. Not 10,000, not 3,000, 1,280. And this tiny population persisted for approximately 117,000 years, more than 100 millennia of living on the absolute edge of extinction. The numbers were staggering. The researchers estimated that the ancestral population experienced a decline of roughly 98.7%. Nearly 99 out of every 100 individuals disappeared. The cause was unknown, but the timing coincided with a major climate transition known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, a period of severe glaciation, extended cold, lowered sea levels, and widespread drought across Africa and Eurasia. The African climate during this period was characterized by prolonged aridity that would have devastated the savanna ecosystems on which early humans depended. If the study is correct, and we will discuss the controversy around it shortly, then the Toba bottleneck was not the most dangerous moment in human history. It was not even close. The most dangerous moment came nearly 1 million years ago, when our ancestors were reduced to a number comparable to an endangered species, a number so small that a single epidemic, a single drought, a single unlucky century could have ended the human lineage forever. And this bottleneck lasted not for a decade, as the Toba volcanic winter did, but for over 100,000 years. The implications are extraordinary. The researchers noted that the timing of this ancient bottleneck aligns with a conspicuous gap in the fossil record. Between about 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, African and Eurasian fossils of human ancestors are remarkably scarce. The gap has long puzzled paleoanthropologists. If there were humans alive during this period, where are their bones? The new study offers an answer. There were very few of them. The population was so small that fossils from this period would be extraordinarily rare, a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. The study also suggested that this ancient bottleneck may have coincided with, or even triggered, the speciation event that gave rise to the last common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern Homo sapiens. When a population is tiny and isolated, evolutionary change happens faster. Genetic drift is stronger. Natural selection can fix advantageous mutations more quickly. A small, embattled population under intense environmental pressure is exactly the kind of crucible in which new species are forged. If this is true, then the near extinction of our ancestors 900,000 years ago may have been the event that created us, not in spite of the bottleneck, but because of it. The pressure that nearly destroyed the human lineage may have been the pressure that shaped it into something new, something with a larger brain, greater behavioral flexibility, and the capacity for the kind of cultural innovation that would eventually carry Homo sapiens to every corner of the planet. But the study was immediately controversial. Other researchers questioned the methodology. The FITCOL method makes assumptions about population structure that may not hold for early human ancestors. The most important assumption is that the ancestral population was a single, well-mixed group. If, instead, humans at that time lived in multiple partially isolated populations that occasionally exchanged migrants, the genetic signal could mimic a bottleneck, even if the total population was much larger. Some replication attempts using different methods failed to detect a bottleneck of the same severity. A 2024 study published in Molecular Biology and Evolution argued that the evidence was insufficient to support such a severe bottleneck, and that simpler demographic models could explain the genetic patterns equally well. The debate continues. It is too early to declare the ancient bottleneck proven or disproven. But the mere possibility that our lineage was once reduced to roughly 1,000 breeding individuals for over 100,000 years is a profound challenge to our understanding of human evolution. It suggests that the thread connecting us to the past is far thinner, far more fragile than we imagined, and it raises questions that the next chapter will explore. What does it mean to survive as a species on the edge? What is the minimum number of humans needed to keep the species alive? And what does the concept of a minimum viable population tell us about how close we really came to vanishing? Chapter 8. The strangest bottleneck. How few people does it take to keep a species alive? This is not an abstract question. It is a practical one, asked every day by conservation biologists working to save endangered animals from extinction. The answer is both simple and deeply unsettling. The number is lower than you think, but the risks at low numbers are higher than you can imagine. In conservation biology, the concept is called minimum viable population, or MVP. It is defined as the smallest population size at which a species can survive in the wild over the long term without facing extinction from random events. These random events fall into several categories. Demographic stochasticity, the chance fluctuations in birth and death rates that can tip a small population into decline even when conditions are otherwise favorable. Environmental stochasticity, the unpredictable changes in climate, food supply, and habitat that affect all populations but are especially dangerous for small ones. Genetic stochasticity, the loss of genetic diversity through drift, inbreeding, and the accumulation of harmful mutations. And catastrophe, rare but devastating events like droughts, floods, fires, epidemics, or volcanic eruptions that can wipe out a significant fraction of a population in a single blow. In 1980, two scientists, Australian geneticist Ian Franklin and American biologist Michael Soule, proposed what became known as the 5,500 rule. The rule states that a minimum of 50 individuals is needed to prevent the worst effects of inbreeding in the short term, and a minimum of 500 individuals is needed to maintain enough genetic diversity for the population to adapt to changing conditions over the long term. These numbers were intended as rough guidelines, not absolute thresholds. They have been revised upward by subsequent research. A 2014 study proposed that the minimums should be closer to 100 individuals for short-term survival and 1,000 for long-term viability. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. If the Toba catastrophe theory is correct, and the human population was reduced to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 effective breeding individuals, then humanity was operating well above the minimum viable threshold. Stressed, certainly. Vulnerable, yes, but not on the immediate brink of extinction from genetic causes alone. But if the 2023 study of the ancient bottleneck is correct, and the human ancestral population was reduced to roughly 1,280 breeding individuals for 117,000 years, then we were operating dangerously close to the minimum viable population threshold. And depending on how the population was distributed, whether it was concentrated in one area or scattered in isolated pockets, and depending on the actual sex ratio and the variance in reproductive success, the effective population size may have been even lower than the census number implies. This matters because the effects of small population size are not merely theoretical. They are biological realities with concrete, measurable consequences. The first and most immediate danger is inbreeding. In a population of 1,280 breeding individuals, the chance of mating with a close relative is significant. Inbreeding does not directly cause problems. The problems come from what inbreeding reveals. Every organism carries a load of harmful recessive mutations, genetic glitches that cause no damage when only one copy is present because the other copy of the gene works fine. But when two carriers of the same recessive mutation mate, their offspring have a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting two copies, and the mutation expresses itself. In large populations, the chance of two carriers meeting is low. In small populations, it is high. The result is inbreeding depression, a measurable decline in health, fertility, and survival that can push a small population further toward extinction. The effects of inbreeding depression are well documented in wild animal populations. Cheetahs, which passed through a severe bottleneck roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, are so genetically uniform that skin grafts between unrelated individuals are not rejected by the immune system. They suffer from low sperm quality, high infant mortality, and vulnerability to disease. Florida panthers, reduced to fewer than 30 individuals by the 1990s, showed spinal deformities, heart defects, and impaired immune function. The California condor population, down to 27 birds in the 1980s, required intensive genetic management during captive breeding to avoid the accumulation of lethal recessive mutations. Humans show evidence of past inbreeding as well. Certain genetic diseases are more common in populations that pass through founder events or bottlenecks. The Afrikaner population of South Africa, descended from a small group of Dutch settlers in the 17th century, has an unusually high incidence of Huntington disease and several metabolic disorders. Ashkenazi Jewish populations, which experienced multiple bottlenecks during centuries of persecution and isolation in Europe, carry elevated frequencies of Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, and several other recessive conditions. The Finnish population, relatively isolated for much of its history, has its own set of rare genetic diseases, sometimes called the Finnish disease heritage. These are the fingerprints of small populations. Every bottleneck leaves its mark in the genome, a signature of reduced diversity, elevated homozygosity, and the occasional harmful mutation that rose to prominence not because it was beneficial, but because the population was too small for natural selection to purge it. The second danger of small population size is genetic drift. In a large population, natural selection is the dominant force shaping which genes survive and which are eliminated. Beneficial mutations spread. Harmful ones are weeded out. In a small population, random chance takes over. A beneficial mutation might be lost simply because its carrier happened to die in an accident or failed to find a mate. A harmful mutation might spread because its carrier happened to have more offspring than average. Over many generations, drift erodes the genetic toolkit of the population, removing variants that might be useful in the future, fixing variants that are slightly harmful, and reducing the raw material on which natural selection can act. This loss of adaptive potential is the long-term danger. A population that survives a bottleneck may appear healthy in the short term, but it has lost options. It has fewer genetic tools for dealing with new diseases, new predators, new climate conditions. It is less resilient, less flexible, more vulnerable to the next shock. For a population of 1,280 individuals sustained over 117,000 years, the genetic consequences would have been severe. Thousands of generations at low numbers, thousands of generations of drift, eroding diversity, fixing random variants, eliminating the rare alleles that represent potential future adaptations. By any standard model, such a population should have emerged from the bottleneck profoundly impoverished in genetic terms. And yet we are here. 8 billion of us, Genetically impoverished compared to chimpanzees, yes, but spectacularly successful by every other measure. Which means that something else was happening during those dark millennia. Something that counteracted the genetic costs of small population size. Something that allowed a few hundred or a few thousand individuals to not just survive, but to retain enough adaptive capacity to eventually explode across the planet. What was that something? There are several possibilities. The first is genetic purging. When a population is small and inbreeding is frequent, harmful recessive mutations are exposed to selection more often than they would be in a large population. Individuals homozygous for a lethal mutation die. Their genes are removed from the pool. Over many generations, this process can actually reduce the genetic load of the population, eliminating the worst mutations and leaving behind a cleaner, if less diverse, genome. Purging is not a cure for the costs of small population size. It cannot restore lost diversity, but it can prevent the worst outcomes of inbreeding depression, buying time for the population to recover. The second is behavioral flexibility. Humans, even archaic humans, were not passive recipients of environmental change. They moved, they innovated, they cooperated, they shared information across generations through language and teaching. A population of 1,000 breeding individuals is small, but if those individuals were behaviorally flexible enough to shift their diet, relocate to better habitat, develop new tools, and maintain social networks that linked dispersed groups, they might have been able to sustain a viable population under conditions that would have doomed a less adaptable species. The third is population structure. The ancient bottleneck may not have involved a single isolated group of 1,280 individuals huddled in one valley. It may have involved multiple small groups scattered across a wide area, occasionally exchanging migrants. This kind of structure, called a metapopulation, can maintain more genetic diversity than a single group of the same total size, because different groups retain different variants, and migration between groups reintroduces diversity that would otherwise be lost. Some researchers have argued that the genetic signal interpreted as a severe bottleneck might actually reflect a structured population of much larger total size, with limited gene flow between groups, creating a pattern that looks like a bottleneck to certain analytical methods. This is one of the central disputes in the current debate. Was there really a bottleneck of 1,280 individuals? Or was there a larger but fragmented population whose structure mimics a bottleneck in the genetic data? The answer matters enormously. A true bottleneck of that severity would imply that human ancestors were genuinely on the edge of extinction for over 100,000 years. A structured population of larger size would imply something less dramatic, but still significant. A species living in small, scattered groups with limited contact, slowly diverging and reconnecting in a complex dance of isolation and mixing. Either way, the picture that emerges is of a species that survived not because it was numerous, not because it was strong, not because it was physically dominant, but because it was clever. Clever enough to find food when food was scarce. Clever enough to cooperate when the environment demanded it. Clever enough to invent new solutions when old ones failed. And lucky enough, barely, to avoid the final blow that would have ended the story before it truly began. The next chapter brings us back to the present, to the modern debate over what the genetic evidence actually tells us, what the archaeological record confirms or denies, and what the scientific community now believes about the bottleneck that shaped us all. The argument is far from settled, but the stakes could not be higher, because what we learn about how our species nearly died tells us something essential about how our species lives. Chapter 9. What the debate reveals. Science does not deal in certainties. It deals in evidence, in models, in arguments tested against data, and revised when new data arrives. The story of the human bottleneck is a perfect illustration of this process. What began as a simple, dramatic hypothesis, Toba nearly killed us all, has evolved into a complex, layered understanding of human demographic history that is still being written. The debate is fierce, productive, and far from over. And what it reveals is not just about what happened 74,000 or 900,000 years ago. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of our species and the limits of our knowledge. Let us take stock of where the evidence stands today. Point 1. The genetic bottleneck is real. This is not seriously disputed. Humans have far less genetic diversity than we should for a species of our size and age. Multiple independent lines of evidence, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, nuclear genome surveys, and microsatellite analyses all converge on the same conclusion. At some point, or at multiple points, in our evolutionary history, the human population was reduced to a very small number. The diversity that was lost during those periods has never been fully recovered. Point 2. The timing is complicated. Early estimates placed the bottleneck at roughly 50 to 100,000 years ago, conveniently overlapping with the Toba eruption. More recent analyses suggest that the genetic signal is not a single sharp event, but a prolonged period of low population size, possibly stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The 2023 study pushed the most severe bottleneck back to 900,000 years ago. Other studies find evidence for a gradual decline in African populations beginning well before Toba and continuing long after. The bottleneck, it seems, was not a moment. It was an era. Point 3. The Toba eruption was real and significant. The eruption at 74,000 years ago was the largest volcanic event in at least 2 million years. It injected enormous quantities of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. It caused measurable climate disruption. The volcanic winter lasted years. The climate effects may have persisted for decades. The eruption's ash has been found on every continent except Antarctica. This was a global event with real consequences. Point 4. The link between Toba and the human bottleneck is weaker than originally thought. Archaeological evidence from Africa and India shows that human populations survived the eruption and, in some cases, thrived in its aftermath. Climate models suggest the volcanic winter was severe but not as catastrophic as early estimates indicated. The genetic signature of the bottleneck does not cleanly align with the eruption date. Non-human animal populations do not show a widespread pattern of bottlenecks at the same time. The Toba catastrophe theory, in its strongest form, is no longer the consensus view. Point 5. The ancient bottleneck at 900,000 years ago is provocative but contested. The 2023 Fitcoal study presented a dramatic finding, a reduction to roughly 1,280 breeding individuals lasting 117,000 years, but the methodology has been questioned. Some researchers argue that the signal could be an artifact of population structure, ancient population subdivision creating a pattern that mathematical models misinterpret as a severe bottleneck. Replication studies using different analytical approaches have produced mixed results. The finding is not confirmed. It is a hypothesis under active investigation. Point 6. The out-of-Africa migration was itself a major bottleneck. When a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, they carried only a subset of the genetic diversity present in the African source population. This founder event is well supported by genetic data and explains much of the reduced diversity seen in non-African populations. It is a bottleneck within a bottleneck, a second constriction layered on top of whatever had already reduced the human gene pool. Point 7. Human population history was structured and complex. Modern genetic methods increasingly suggest that early humans did not live as a single panmictic population. Instead, they existed as a network of partially isolated groups, sometimes connected by migration, sometimes separated for thousands of years. This structure, which some researchers call the stem population model, means that the demographic history of Homo sapiens cannot be captured by a single population size trajectory. Different groups experienced different histories, some expanding while others contracted, some mixing while others diverged. The genetic patterns we see today are the result of this complex web, not a simple narrative of crash and recovery. So where does this leave us? What can we say with confidence about the bottleneck that shaped our species? We can say that for most of our history, humans were few. Not just during the Toba period, but for hundreds of thousands of years before and after. The effective population size of our species was consistently in the range of thousands to tens of thousands, a tiny number compared to many other large mammals. We were a species of campfires, not cities. A species of small bands moving through enormous landscapes, separated by vast distances, linked by the thinnest threads of kinship and migration. We can say that this small population size had real consequences. Our limited genetic diversity makes us more vulnerable to certain diseases. It explains why genetic disorders are more common in populations that pass through additional bottlenecks. It explains why humans are so genetically similar to one another compared to other primates. And it means that the entire human species, for all its current numbers and reach, grew from a foundation so narrow that the slightest additional pressure might have snuffed it out entirely. We can say that the survival of our species was not guaranteed. It was contingent. It depended on being in the right place, with the right skills, at the right time. It depended on the flexibility of human cognition, the ability to shift diets, invent tools, cooperate with strangers, and transmit knowledge across generations. It depended on luck, the random chance that enough individuals survived each crisis to produce the next generation. Take away any one of these factors, and the outcome might have been very different. We can say that the debate itself reveals something important about the nature of deep time and the limits of scientific knowledge. When we try to reconstruct events that happened tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago, we are working with incomplete data. Fossils are rare, artifacts are scattered, genetic models are powerful but dependent on assumptions that may not hold. Every conclusion comes with uncertainty. Every finding is provisional. This is not a weakness of science. It is its greatest strength. The willingness to revise, to question, to test and retest is what separates scientific knowledge from mythology. The Toba catastrophe theory was a bold hypothesis. It was testable. It was tested. It was found to be partly correct and partly wrong. The eruption mattered. The bottleneck was real. But the simple story of one volcano nearly ending the human species has given way to a more nuanced understanding of a complex demographic history shaped by multiple factors over hundreds of thousands of years. And that nuanced understanding is, in many ways, more interesting than the simple story, because it tells us that the human species did not face one existential crisis. It faced many. Over and over, across millennia, our ancestors were pushed to the edge. Over and over, they found a way back, not because they were invincible, not because they were destined to survive, but because they were adaptable, creative, and, when it mattered most, cooperative. There is a concept in ecology called the extinction vortex. It describes the feedback loop that pulls small populations toward oblivion. Small numbers lead to inbreeding. Inbreeding leads to reduced fitness. Reduced fitness leads to lower reproduction. Lower reproduction leads to smaller numbers, and the cycle tightens with each turn. Most species that enter the extinction vortex do not escape it. They spiral downward until the population hits zero. Humans entered the vortex more than once, and every time they climbed out. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost. The cost is written in our DNA, in the missing diversity, in the elevated disease frequencies, in the genetic scars of a species that nearly bled out more than once. But they climbed out, and eventually, slowly, painfully, they began to grow. The growth, when it came, was explosive. Sometime around 50 to 60,000 years ago, the human population began to expand. New technologies appeared: bone tools, fishing hooks, sewing needles, art, music, symbolic behavior that leaves its traces in cave paintings, carved figurines, and beads traded across hundreds of kilometers. The Upper Paleolithic Revolution, as some researchers call it, transformed human societies and, eventually, the planet itself. Was this revolution triggered by the bottleneck? Was it the product of the intense selective pressure that came with living in small, stressed populations for tens of thousands of years? Did the very crisis that nearly destroyed us forge the cognitive and cultural capacities that would eventually make us the dominant species on Earth? The question is speculative, but it is also tantalizing. Because if the answer is yes, then the bottleneck was not just a near miss, it was a crucible, and what emerged from it was something the world had never seen before. The final chapter takes us to the heart of that question. What did the bottleneck make us? What did we lose? What did we gain? And what does the entire story, from the eruption of Toba to the genetic echo in your blood, tell us about the species that survived? Chapter 10. The Thread That Held. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world 74,000 years ago. Not the whole world, just one small piece of it. A riverbank in Eastern Africa. The dry season is deep and the river has stopped flowing. What remains is a string of muddy pools stretching along the channel, each one smaller than the last. The surrounding landscape is brown. Grass has died back to stubble. Trees stand bare, or nearly so, their leaves dropped to conserve moisture. The sky has a strange quality, a milky haze that mutes the sunlight and steals the blue. Sunsets are vivid, blood red and orange, but they bring no warmth. The nights are cold, colder than they should be, colder than anyone can remember. A small group of people sit near one of the pools, perhaps 20 of them, perhaps fewer. They are thin. The hunting has been poor. The animals that once gathered at the river have moved on or died. The tubers they dug last season are exhausted, but the pools still hold fish. Small ones mostly, trapped as the water receded, flicking in the shallows. Easy to catch by hand or with a pointed stick. Not enough to feast on, enough to survive. A woman tends a small fire. The wood is dry and burns quickly. She feeds it with sticks collected from the bare branches overhead. A man sits nearby, working a piece of stone with practiced hands. He is shaping a small triangular point, symmetrical, thin, designed to fit the end of a straight shaft. An arrow. He has made many of these. His father showed him how, and his father before that. The technique is precise. Strike too hard, and the stone shatters. Strike too soft and the edge remains blunt. Every blow counts. A child watches from behind the woman. The child is perhaps 4 years old. Thin, like everyone else, but alive, alert, learning. This is what the bottleneck looked like. Not a single cataclysm, not a wall of fire or a wave of ash, a slow constriction, a thinning. A world growing harder, season by season, year by year, decade by decade. Food becoming scarcer, water becoming rarer, groups shrinking as the old died and the young were born into less. The margin between survival and extinction narrowing to almost nothing. And yet, that child watched, that child learned, that child grew up and had children of their own. And those children carried in their cells a record of everything that had happened, every ancestor who survived, every lineage that persisted, every mutation that drifted to prominence in a population too small to correct the randomness of inheritance. The record is in you, right now, in your mitochondria, in your chromosomes, in the particular arrangement of 3 billion chemical letters that make you who you are. You are a descendant of survivors. Every person alive today is not survivors in a metaphorical sense, survivors in the most literal, biological, unyielding sense of the word. Your ancestors survived the Toba eruption, or at least its aftermath. They survived the droughts that preceded it. They survived the glacial periods that followed. They survived the ancient bottleneck 900,000 years ago, if that bottleneck is confirmed. They survived predators, parasites, famines, floods, and epidemics that have left no trace in any written record because they happened before writing existed, before agriculture existed, before permanent settlement existed. They survived with stone tools, fire, language, cooperation, and a brain that could adapt to conditions no other species on Earth could have endured. This is what the bottleneck story ultimately teaches. Not that we were lucky, though luck was part of it. Not that we were strong, though strength helped, but that we were flexible. That the defining trait of Homo sapiens is not size, not speed, not ferocity, but the capacity to change behavior in response to changing conditions, to see a problem and invent a solution, to communicate that solution to others, to build on accumulated knowledge generation after generation, ratcheting upward from simple stone points to bows and arrows, to fish traps, to boats, to cities, to spacecraft. The bottleneck shaped us. It did not just reduce our numbers. It concentrated the survivors. It selected, however imperfectly, for the traits that mattered most under extreme stress: intelligence, cooperation, flexibility, the ability to eat almost anything, to live almost anywhere, to turn any environment into a temporary home. The genetic diversity we lost during those dark millennia has never been fully recovered. But the adaptive capacity we retained, and perhaps sharpened, under the pressure of near extinction, made possible everything that followed. Consider the founder effect. When a small group separates from a larger population, the genetic quirks of that small group become amplified in their descendants. Random traits become common not because they are beneficial, but because they happen to be present in the founders. This is usually discussed as a cost, a source of genetic disease and reduced diversity, but it can also be a source of rapid change. In a small population, a beneficial mutation spreads much faster than in a large one. Natural selection is more efficient when there are fewer individuals to compete. If the bottleneck coincided with intense environmental pressure, the survivors may have been disproportionately those individuals carrying the most advantageous traits. The bottleneck may have been a filter, removing not just individuals but genetic variants, and what passed through the filter was a population enriched for the traits that would define our species going forward. This is speculative. We cannot prove that the bottleneck shaped specific traits. We cannot point to a gene and say, this survived the Toba period because it conferred an advantage. Genetics does not work that cleanly, especially over such deep timescales. But the general principle is sound. Small populations under intense pressure evolve fast. And the human species, in the 50 to 60,000 years since the population began to recover, has evolved at a pace that is breathtaking by any standard. The expansion out of Africa, which began roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, was the first great demonstration of this adaptive capacity. A small group, carrying only a fraction of Africa's genetic diversity, walked into a world already occupied by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic humans. Within 20 to 30,000 years, Homo sapiens had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They crossed deserts, mountains, oceans, and ice sheets. They colonized tropical jungles and Arctic tundra. They displaced or absorbed every other human species they encountered. The Neanderthals vanished. The Denisovans vanished. Homo erectus vanished. Only Homo sapiens remained. The bottleneck may have been part of the reason. A species forged in crisis, with a deep cultural toolkit and an unmatched capacity for behavioral adaptation, was uniquely equipped to colonize new environments. Every challenge was a problem to solve. Every obstacle was a puzzle to crack. And every solution once found was transmitted to the next generation through language and teaching, creating a cumulative cultural inheritance that grew richer and more powerful with each passing century. But the bottleneck also left scars. The reduced genetic diversity that we carry is not just a historical curiosity. It has real consequences today. Humans are more susceptible to certain diseases because we lack the genetic variation that provides resistance. Populations that pass through additional bottlenecks, like the out-of-Africa migration or the founder events that accompanied the colonization of the Americas and the Pacific Islands, carry even less diversity and show elevated rates of genetic disease. The fingerprints of ancient population crashes are written into the health profiles of living people. There is another lesson embedded in the bottleneck story, a lesson not about genetics but about fragility. The human species, for all its current power, is not invulnerable. We have reshaped the planet. We have split the atom. We have walked on the moon. We have sequenced our own genome. And yet, 74,000 years ago, we nearly did not make it. A volcanic eruption, one among many in the long geological history of the Earth, came close to ending the human experiment before it produced a single city, a single book, a single symphony. And that eruption was not the worst of it. If the ancient bottleneck at 900,000 years ago is confirmed, then our ancestors survived something even more extreme. 117,000 years at the edge of extinction, 1,280 breeding individuals holding the entire future of the human species in their hands, their genes, their choices. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, traces back to those few. Every language, every culture, every nation, every dream, every act of love or cruelty or genius or folly flows from that thread. The thread held, but it could have broken, and the universe would not have noticed. The Toba eruption left behind a lake 100 kilometers long. The bottleneck left behind a species with less genetic diversity than a troop of chimpanzees. The survivors left behind everything else. Every painting on every cave wall, every stone point shaped by careful hands, every fire lit against the cold, every child taught to find water, to track game, to read the sky and the seasons. Every word spoken in every language that has ever existed, all of it descends from a population so small it could have fit in a single village. This is the most astonishing thing about the human story. Not that we conquered the planet, not that we built civilizations, not that we reached for the stars, but that we almost did not exist at all. That the gap between everything we have become and absolute nothingness was, for a very long time, terrifyingly narrow. Who survived the bottleneck? We do not know their names. We do not know their faces. We do not know their stories. But we carry their DNA. We carry their legacy. We carry the proof that they existed in every cell of our bodies. And we owe them everything. Not because they were heroes, not because they were chosen, but because they held on, because they did not give up. Because when the sky went dark and the world turned cold and every reasonable calculation said the end had come, they built a fire, they shaped a stone, they fed a child, and they waited for the light to return. It returned. It always returns, but only if someone is still there to see it. If you enjoy these deep nighttime journeys through the hidden chapters of our past, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these stories possible. Tell me in the comments, does the bottleneck story change how you see yourself? Does knowing how close we came to vanishing make you think differently about what we have built since? And what topic should we investigate next? The mystery of the Denisovans, the first Americans, the lost civilizations buried beneath the sea. These stories are not just history, they are your history, written not in books, but in your blood. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next investigation.